Welcome to A Parent's Guide to Child Development. I'm your host, Annamarie von Firley from Fledgling's Flight. Each podcast, we strive to give parents the tools they need to help their child thrive through conversations with experts in child development and psychology, where you can learn about the most important information that you didn't know existed. If your child is smart, capable, and creative, but somehow can't get their thoughts onto paper, or reads a page 5 times without absorbing a word, or has handwriting that looks like it belongs to someone half their age, today's episode is for you. We're taking a deep dive into one of the sneakiest reflexes when it comes to school struggles, the Asymmetric Tonic Neck Reflex, or ATNR. It is the reflex that's supposed to help babies coordinate the two sides of their body, link their vision and hearing, and lay the groundwork for reading, writing, and crossing the midline. When it doesn't fade on time, it can quietly sabotage a child's academic life for years and get mislabeled as laziness, defiance, ADHD, or dyslexia along the way. I am thrilled to have Emily Roper back with us, Neurodevelopmental Delay Therapist, certified midwife assistant, founder of Early Roots, and host of the Early Roots podcast. Emily, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
Yes, I mean, why stop now? We've had so many awesome episodes. I think this will be our fifth one. So, all on reflexes and their importance. And if you are just tuning in and this is your first one, there are many other ones that you should be listening to as well that are going to be also full of wisdom and information. Let's start with the basics for anyone joining us for the first time. What is the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, the ATNR, and what job is it doing in those first months of a baby's life?
Yeah, so an ATNR is a reflex where when babies turn their head to either side, the arm and leg on the side they're facing extend, and the arm and leg on the opposite side bend. So the best way to visualize that would be to think of like an archer's pose. And this reflex plays a lot, it has a lot of jobs that it does. One of the first things that it does is it encourages babies to move when they're in the womb. And I've mentioned this on previous episodes, but it's worth stating that the brain develops based on movement and use and experience. So we have to move our body and engage with the environment in order for our brains to develop and function properly. So we come kind of hardwired with some of these early reflexes that really force and encourage movements and that helps to develop the brain, it helps to develop the body. There's a lot of things that are going into that. So it encourages movement when babies are in the womb, and then it also assists with the birth process. So as babies are being born, they are actively participating in that process, and they use a lot of different reflexes, this being one of them, to help them make a lot of different rotations and movements that they need to make to navigate that process and make it less likely that they get stuck. So it helps to create some asymmetry in the shoulders. It helps to encourage their head to move in different ways so that that process will ideally go smoothly for them. And then after birth, it is one of the earliest forms of hand-eye coordination and training. So babies can't see very far. They can only see, about 18 inches or so, 12 to 18 inches. And one of the things that it's helping them to do is to learn to fixate their vision. So when they're in the womb, they are exposed to light, but you have like no depth really. They get light exposure, but they don't get to see in anywhere near the same way that they do when they're born. And all of a sudden they're born and they just have all of this visual information that is available to them. And they have to learn how to use their eyes. Our eyes don't come naturally knowing exactly how to function. We learn how to use and we learn how to see based on how we use our eyes. And this reflex helps them when their head turns, their arm extends out, and typically what you'll see is that their hand is in their visual field. And so it's helping teach their eyes how to focus and fixate on something, which is a really important skill. We need to be able to focus our visual attention on something. So it's helping that. But while this reflex is present, it kind of creates this invisible connection between the head, the eyes, and the hand, where whatever the head's doing, the eyes and hand follow. And it's very difficult for older children who still have this reflex to use those three parts of their body in a really coordinated way. They're kind of stuck in this more immature pattern of functioning. And what you see then is that, the other thing, let me back up. The other thing that it's doing is it's creating this kind of invisible connection at the midline of the body because the two sides of the body are doing opposite things. So one side extends, the other side flexes, and that's good because it's helping babies to develop the skill of being able to do different things with different sides of their body. So we have different patterns of movement that go from more simple to more complex, and at first what we have is babies that do mostly whole body movements where their whole body is working together and moving together as one. And then we eventually want to break up the left and right sides of our body and the upper and lower halves of our body. So this reflex is helping to kind of break up the left and right sides so that our left side can do something different from our right side. But while this reflex is still present, it makes kind of a very immature connection between the two so that they can do opposite things but not in a really coordinated and integrated way. And these kids tend to have a hard time moving from one side of their body to the next, coordinating their left and right sides. It's just a very immature process that's happening. Great for little babies. It's what they need at that time, but we should develop more mature ways of interacting with our body as we get bigger.
Yeah, the when I talk about it with the midline, crossing the midline, is that there's this imaginary line that separates, like you were saying, the left and the right side and your upper body from the lower half, and then there's symmetrical movement like clapping or jumping jacks, and then there's asymmetrical, which is like opening a jar, or doing a button, and so you really have to have that asymmetrical movement, or you there's just so many things you're not going to be able to do. And
Yes.
crossing the midline, so kids are not born being able to touch the side of their body, give themselves a hug. They're they'll bring their fists as close together as close as they can get to crossing that midline until it's developed. And these things don't necessarily develop, or we shouldn't count on them actually developing on their own. When I talk about it, it's like a series of dominoes, and if one of those dominoes is removed, then that cascade doesn't continue. So there can be uh, intervention that needs to be done in order for these
Mhm.
reflexes to integrate to be able to build those skills. Because without the ATNR and the STNR, then they can't ride a bike and they can't swim, and there's just like so many things that are difficult for them because there isn't that coordination between the two halves of their bodies, the
Yeah.
upper and lower and the left and the right side.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, so the ATNR is supposed to integrate around 3 months of age, one of the earliest to fade. Why does it go need to go so quickly, and what does a baby's body need to do to be ready to do next?
So there's a couple of things that are happening as that reflex integrates. Like you said, there's like better coordination. We can have more advanced skills between the left and right sides of our body. The other big thing that's happening is that babies are learning to track. So they're learning to follow something that's moving. They're learning to move their eyes side to side. They're learning to go from the left side of their body to the right side of their body and back and forth. And tracking is really important once you start navigating your environment. So before the ATNR is developed, kids don't really actively move themselves through their environment. So it tends to integrate before kids are crawling. And crawling is the first stage in which babies are really like actively participating in engaging with their own environment. Other before then it's passive. It's mom or dad or somebody moving them around. But once they start crawling, they're actually choosing where they're moving. They're really actively engaging in a different way. And the ability to track and use your eyes more effectively is really important. And that's what's really developing as you start to really engage with the environment. And so when this reflex stays present, a lot of times kids struggle with that visual piece. So they struggle with the coordination, like I said, too, the left and right sides. They struggle with the crossing the midline, but they also tend to really struggle with those visual skills and being able to coordinate and use their eyes in a really effective way. And so that's typically what I see in older kids is one of the bigger issues. That's what kind of eventually, and I'm sure we'll get to this, like connects with reading and writing and the school piece of things. So, it's important in infancy, but it tends to be even more and more important the more advanced skills we're doing later on.
Hmm. What are the most common reasons the ATNR doesn't integrate on schedule?
There's a lot of it's a little tricky because I don't typically look at reflexes separately when it comes to risk factors. Risk factors kind of tend to come all together. So all the risk factors that I look at for all retained reflexes, not just the ATNR, are going to be birth complications, trauma and stress during pregnancy, toxin or drug exposure in pregnancy, not getting enough movement or stimulation after infancy or during early infancy. So kids that, like I work with kids, some adopted kids that grew up in orphanages where they were just like really, they didn't get a lot of stimulation at all. They didn't get a lot of movement. Those things are major risk factors. But basically, lots of things that are happening during from conception all the way through the first year can disrupt those reflex processes. The ATNR in particular seems to be a little bit sensitive to birth process. I think because we use that reflex so much when we're born vaginally, and that process of using it in that very specific time period seems to be really helpful in getting it to work and integrate properly. So things like a C-section where you're bypassing that reflex, they don't get to use it. Things like forceps or vacuum delivery, those things increase your risk of having a retained ATNR. And again, these are just risk factors. It doesn't always turn out that way. Um, and some kids don't. Some kids still have that reflex and they were born vaginally. So there's multiple things that can go into it.
Yeah, and we have an entire episode all about risk factors and complications. So, if this is the first one of our episodes on retained reflexes that you are joining us in, have a look on further back, and you can find the episode that is about an hour long, all about the different risks and complications that can cause retained reflexes. Most parents would never guess a reflexive phase by 3 months should affect their 8-year-old's grade level reading skills. Why is the ATNR so foundational to learning?
Yeah, so the ATNR is probably one of the biggest things that I see contribute to reading, writing, and writing difficulties in particular, learning in general, but those two things specifically. And a lot of it has to do with that visual tracking piece that I mentioned, and the ability to coordinate the left and right sides of our body, which doesn't seem like it has anything to do with reading or writing. But really, the ability to read is foundation, or the ability to read is dependent on a lot of these early foundational skills. So in order to read properly, you have to be able to follow the words on the page. So you have to be able to track visually. Your eyes have to converge properly, meaning they both turn in and they're working together as a team to see one really clear image. We have to have good spatial awareness so that we can just easily and automatically recognize the difference between B and D and P because those are all very small changes in shape and direction. And all of those skills are built during this early infancy stage. And though these reflexes, particularly the ATNR reflex, plays a really big role in helping us to do all of these things automatically. When it's there and it's stuck, then kids struggle with things like posture, where it's very difficult when they're moving their head for them to not then move their body as well, which affects our ability to focus. And um, the ATNR also, like I said, affects vision and tracking. And if we can't track properly, if our eyes don't work smoothly, it can be very, very difficult to read and write properly. Then the ATNR also has connections with the hand. Like I mentioned, there's kind of this invisible connection between the head, the hand, the eyes. So if we're trying to coordinate our hand to write properly and our eyes and head and hand don't coordinate well together, it can become kind of a disaster for kids to try to force all of these pieces to work well for them when they should really just be automatic.
Hmm. So let's go back to talking about crossing the midline, the visible line that's down the center of the body. What does it mean to cross the midline, and why does a retained ATNR make it so difficult?
Yeah, so the ATNR really breaks the body into two pieces. And so, but whatever the right side of the body is, the left is doing, the left side of the body does the opposite, which isn't the same as being really well coordinated. It doesn't mean that we can do something over here and nothing on this side. It means there's still a lot of immature connections, even though they're not doing the same thing. They're doing opposite things, but they don't really coordinate and integrate well together. They're still connected in kind of an immature way. And that's important for coordination things. You know, it's important for things like catching a ball and handwriting and things where we actually use those skills. But it's also really important because the way the left and right sides of our body are functioning directly affect the way that the left and right sides of our brain are functioning. And so there's lots of connections that happen between the left and right sides of our brain that are being built as the left and right sides of our body are learning to coordinate together. And so when we don't have good left and right integration in our body and our brain, it really can affect things like executive functioning and cognitive processing and memory and all of these skills that should develop kind of automatically. There's just slower connections there when those pieces aren't being built. So the inability to cross the midline is also like is a problem by itself, but it's also kind of a reflection of some deeper delays and problems that are going on internally that are a lot harder to measure.
Hmm. The ATNR is supposed to help a baby integrate vision and hearing, turning the head towards a sound, tracking a moving object with the eyes. How does it translate into classroom skills years later?
Yeah, so all of these pieces, like I kind of mentioned before, are automatic pieces. We should automatically be able to hear things and process auditory information and visual information. We should be able to move our head without our body getting engaged. We should really like be able to do all of these pieces smoothly and easily. And when we can't, it tanks things like attention. It tanks our ability to learn and to function in a classroom because we're having to put so much effort into doing things that really should just be automatic.
Hmm. And the going back to the tracking skills with the eyes, how that can play out is skipping words or like not reading comprehension becomes a problem because they're not absorbing all the words, they're skipping over them. And then in addition to, you really see it in math, like word problems, because they're having to read a paragraph and understand, comprehend what's being asked, and then like create an equation that is
Yeah.
going to solve the question. But oftentimes, what happens is the kids will just pluck out the numbers and then just make up an equation because they haven't like actually read the word problem. So it
Yeah.
really shows up around third grade when kids start doing word problems in math.
Yeah, that's for sure true.
Yeah. Establishing a dominant hand is a big developmental milestone. How does a retained ATNR interfere with that? And what should parents watch for in preschool and kindergarten?
Sure. So, yes, dominant hand is really important because it shows us that there is a lot of neurological connections in the brain, specifically around that specific hand. So, it's really kind of specialized. We want it to be specialized so that it can really coordinate and do things well. And that is a slow process that is happening during the kind of preschool, kindergarten years. We expect that by age 6 or 7 that you really see a well-established dominant hand. It makes fine motor skills significantly easier. And it tells us that, you know, there's a lot of good brain and hand connections that have been built during that time. So that really is should be well established and should be working well for kids by the time that they're getting into more in-depth writing. I know we do some writing things early, like before age 6 or 7, but by the time you're like really focused on writing, you should have a dominant hand. Um, and so, and again, that can be kind of difficult to see in kids if you're not really specifically trained and looking for it. But it would be, you know, like if you notice that your child never has a hand preference or they switch all of the time. And some kids will like have a hand preference for coloring and then a different one for eating, which is okay. Sometimes they can switch a little bit. But if, for example, like sometimes they eat with their left hand, sometimes they eat with their right, and they're like 5, 6, 7, they're getting into that range, then that's a red flag. That's something to look out for. When they're 2, they're still experimenting and figuring it out. Some kids have preferences early, but we don't typically worry about it until they start to get a little bit older.
Mm-hmm. Bilateral coordination, using both sides of the body together, like clapping, jumping jacks, or holding a paper still while cutting with scissors. How does the ATNR shape this?
Yeah, so it is like laying the foundation again for our coordination of the left and right sides of our body. And so, like I mentioned, when it's still there, they are doing opposite things, but they're still connected in a really immature way. So we want to, it's a great start to get us out of that whole body movements only, but it's not where we should end. We should end with the ability to use our left and right sides independently, where they can do the same thing, they can do opposite things, they can one can work and the other can be still. And that is kind of what we mean when we talk about bilateral coordination and the ability to really coordinate and use those two sides of our body effectively. And again, that's obviously important for things like catching a ball and writing and those physical coordination pieces, but it's also a reflection of internally what's going on in our brain and the ability for the left and right sides of our brain to communicate effectively, which we want them to communicate well because that affects all sorts of cognitive and executive functioning pieces. So when the body is not working right, that tells us internally that the brain is likely struggling too.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to reading. I had mentioned that when kids are reading that, oftentimes they'll skip over words or they'll lose their place in a paragraph. What kinds of activities can you give a kid to help keep their place when reading?
Sure. So what I usually do is if we're working on, if I'm working with a child who's struggling with those things, typically the most common things that we'll be working on at that time would be ATNR reflex that we just talked about, and vestibular system. That's a
Mm.
little apparatus in your ear that helps you understand spatial awareness and things like that. Also really important for reading and understanding direction and that type of thing. We're usually working on those two things, sometimes some other reflexes and things as well. And so, really, I don't focus on reading a lot. Like, I'm not giving kids a bunch of reading practice and reading skills because, in general, I don't feel like that is super effective when we have these underlying things. What I'm working on is all of the like exercises and things that develop those pieces. And then if we're looking at reading stuff, there's a lot of things that we can do to help kids cope with reading stuff while we're working on this stuff. So things like sometimes I'll give them a little tool where they can like block off different lines so that they only see one line at a time. That can be really helpful, so that they don't have to follow quite as much. I don't care if they use their finger. I know some teachers, some people like they don't want you to use your finger, but I tell kids like put your finger on the word and follow it and read it. Again, sometimes if their hand-eye coordination is really bad, then that's going all over the place and it's not as helpful. Um, I have parents and families, if they can, to use like bigger print and bigger letters, bigger words, because it's not as taxing on the visual system. So really just understanding that if they've got these things going on, that they're not seeing well, they're not coordinating their eyes well, they're having a hard time with all of those pieces. And if you can reduce the load on that, then a lot of times you'll see reading gets easier. And especially when it comes to things like reading comprehension, if there's something like a word problem in math where it's not about reading, it's about math, then we talk about things like have somebody that can read it to them out loud,
Right.
so that they don't have to focus on the reading part. They can actually focus on the math and the word problem because the math is what we care about in this particular lesson.
Hmm.
Um, and I know that that can be sometimes these adaptations can feel like hard for parents to accept. They're like, they just need to practice and get better. And, we don't want to make it too easy for them. But the reality is that we need to bring it down to a level where they can actually do the math or they can actually like get some of the reading comprehension or where we are meeting them where they're at, because like brute forcing through reading problems and writing problems and math problems is rarely ever the if ever the answer, and a lot of times will result in kids being very emotionally dysregulated and frustrated and hating reading and writing and thinking that they're stupid and never it can really go, you can go down kind of a bad path if you're really trying to force kids to do something that they're not ready to do. So I'm all about giving them adaptations, and then as we know that their skills are coming in, then we obviously back off. We don't they don't get to use all of the little tools forever. Once we know that their capacity is increased, then we increase our expectations of what they can do. But
Do you ever coordinate with developmental optometrists where they're really focusing on the visual tracking and convergence and building the ocular muscles? Or is this something that these tend not to get paired together as far as working with kids that are having like tracking skills?
no, I have a great like vision therapy group here that I love, and I love having kids that I share with them. So it's great. We want to the only like concern is sometimes if we're working on like the stress response, then we need to ease up on some of the eye stuff for a little bit. So
Mhm.
we want to coordinate making sure that we're not doing too much. But it can be really helpful to have them work on eye stuff at the same time. Sometimes you work through reflex stuff and kids don't need a ton of eye work afterwards. Sometimes they do. And it's really great because I do like a little bit of eye stuff, but mostly I'm focused on reflex stuff. And, I use the eye stuff to kind of more like just to monitor and see and kind of get baselines and to track a couple of things. But then they go really in depth into the visual piece of things. So that can be very helpful.
Handwriting is one of the most talked about symptoms of a retained ATNR. Messy, slow, painful, or resistant to writing at all. Can you walk us through why?
Yeah, a big part of it is just that head-eye hand coordination piece is so immature and so difficult, um, that they're already struggling with things like tracking and getting their eyes to work. They're already struggling with things like spatial awareness and posture and all of these things. And then now you're adding in on top of that, they have to do these fine motor movements and like coordinate their hand. It's just writing is a more advanced skill than reading. You have all of the components that come into reading, and then you also have the handwriting piece of things. And it can just be very difficult for kids that have an ATNR reflex. A lot of times, what you'll see is that they really adjust their posture in order to compensate. So these are the kids that you'll see that often like have their head up or their arm up on the desk and they lay their head on their hand and their paper is all shifted to one side of their body so they don't actually have to cross their midline and their hand is like working out over here so that their arm can be extended and this one can be flexed and they don't have to fight that posture anymore. It kind of diminishes the load on their eyes. And most people look at that and are like, just sit up. Why are you being so lazy and tired on your desk? But really, they're kind of compensating they're doing what they need to do in order to function and to reduce the load so that they can work properly. So in my opinion, I know there are some people that probably would disagree with this, but I don't care what posture and position kids are working in. If it is helping them to get their school assignment done, then I'm not picky about that at all. Eventually, obviously, we want to work through these things so that they can have good posture. But until then, we don't fight it at all. Just let them be.
Hmm. Copying from the board is a classroom skill that quietly breaks kids with retained ATNR. What is happening in their brain and body when they try?
Yeah, so copying from a board is really, it can be quite tough because there's a lot of things that are going on. I also actually see this in connection a lot with an STNR reflex, not just an ATNR. There's a lot of these kind of postural reflexes that affect that skill. But basically, what you do is you're having a kid that's looking up and looking down, so their head is changing positions a lot. They have to focus visually on something that's close up and then refocus visually on something that's further away. That is a pretty advanced skill. Even just being able to focus our visual attention on one thing. So to coordinate our two eyes, to get them to converge properly and see properly, that by itself can be hard. Then when we're asking kids to shift and go quickly from what's in front of them to something that's further away, that skill is even a more advanced skill to be able to do that. So not only is this like pretty advanced physically or visually, but also we're getting a lot of change in head position and head movement. And ideally, at school age, they should be able to move their head in any direction they want and their body can stay still. But for kids that have retained reflexes, that's not true. Their head goes up and down, and they're going to be fighting a lot of responses in their body that are going to make their body want to move. So
Mm.
those two pieces are important. Also, when you talk about looking up, depending on where they're positioned in the classroom, there can be a lot of visually distracting things. It can be very hard to tune all of that out and focus on something that's further away. Kids that have retained reflexes, I encourage them to sit near the front of the classroom if you have kind of that shape of a classroom, um, so that there's less distracting things. But then now you have to not only deal with all that, but then you're coming back and you're trying to actually write and coordinate your hands. And it's a lot. It's just too much for kids that have a lot of these reflexes that really starts to fall apart and they can struggle.
Hmm. Getting thoughts onto paper, written expression is another big struggle. Why does a kid who can tell you a beautiful, detailed story out loud produce three broken sentences on the page?
It's all of those same things. It's that mentally, cognitively, they're smart enough to understand the concepts, but then when you have to actually coordinate the body and get it to work right, then it starts to fall apart. And that right there is like a really big red flag that I see is like, okay, these kids are smart and they can do it out loud, but then when it comes to actually coordinating their hands to get it to happen, it falls apart. To me, that's like ding, 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 big red flag that there is something physical, most likely reflexes and vestibular stuff going on, because they're obviously smart enough to do it, but they have to put all of their effort into coordinating their eyes or hands, and then it falls apart.
Hmm. So many kids with a retained ATNR get labeled with dyslexia or written off as just not a strong reader. What's the overlap between dyslexia and a retained ATNR, and how do you tell the difference?
Yeah, I know of one study that was done by Sally Goddard Blythe looking at kids with dyslexia diagnosis and then looking to see if there was a correlation between that and a variety of different early development pieces. And I know the ATNR was one of them. I can't remember the exact number, but it was high. It was like above 85% of the kids with a dyslexia diagnosis had a retained ATNR. Also, it was even higher that those kids had visual motor problems and visual perception problems. Those were in like the 90 plus percentage of people or of kids. So we know that there's a significant correlation between a dyslexia diagnosis and these types of early problems. Now that was just looking, that was just looking at the correlation. That study didn't then, see like they didn't then take care of those things and retest the kids and see which ones then didn't qualify after. So that is research that we should be doing and has yet to be done, at least that I know of. But we know that there's a significant correlation. That's exactly what I see in my practice. When kids come in with a dyslexia diagnosis, they are significantly more likely than the general population to have a retained ATNR, to have vestibular issues, to have visual motor issues. And a lot of times when you clean those things up, at the very least, you get improvement in reading and writing. And sometimes you get kids that just excel and are above and beyond where they need to be with reading and writing, and they don't qualify for that diagnosis anymore. But again, I don't have the numbers specifically on like what just improves symptoms and what actually would eliminate them in that
Yeah, and
case.
if your kid's been diagnosed with dyslexia, having them check to see if they have a retained ATNR or any other reflexes
Mhm.
would not be a terrible thing to do.
No, at the very least, it will support them and make those things easier, even if for some kids it's not like the cure all to everything.
Right.
It might not be. But it can at least make those things easier. If you have that compounding, then that's at least very treatable. The reflexes are very treatable.
Um, Children who have issues with spelling, is that point to a retained ATNR as well?
Spelling is one of the things that for some kids really like cleans up beautifully and for others never comes along. In English, I don't really worry that much about spelling because spelling in English is really actually more about memorization. Um, our like the way that we spell breaks. Like we have all of these spelling rules and then all these exceptions in these breaks. And so spelling is one of the things that like may never be intuitive for some kids and really seems to be more affected by memory and how well you can memorize and how much you read. And they're saying like the more that you read tends to be the better you spell just because visually you're seeing those words more and more. It's not a skill that I really get too concerned about when kids don't spell well. That's not necessarily an indicator that there's some other problem. We just have kind of a ridiculous language and spelling system. And the nice thing in today's age is that we have spell check. And so
Right.
it's not going to hold too many people back if they're bad spellers. Obviously, it would be great if they can spell well, but again, it mostly seems to have to do with how well kids memorize versus an innate problem.
Hmm. A lot of what looks like ADHD in the classroom, fidgeting, avoiding writing tasks, zoning out, taking forever to finish work, can actually be a retained ATNR working overtime. How do you help parents and teachers untangle those?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of related to all of these pieces that we've been talking about it developing these automatic pieces. So when you have an 18R that's present and you have problems with things like vision and crossing the midline and posture, and none of these things are working right, it creates all sorts of secondary symptoms with attention, with learning, with focusing, with hyperactivity and fidgeting. And it's not typically just the ATNR reflex that I see. Usually I see these things in combination. So it's not just like, oh, they have one reflex and it's causing all these problems. It's like, no, they have that reflex and six others, and their vestibular system's not working right, and their vision's not working right, and that's affecting posture. And we just have this whole domino effect where we see all of these early development pieces are not working well, and we need to clean those things up, and then we can actually get a better picture of like where we're at with things like attention and learning and these more advanced skills. We need these kind of baseline pieces happening first.
When kids with a retained 18 are often describe school as exhausting, when they haven't done anything physical, why does using an unintegrated nervous system take so much energy?
It's because all of these pieces shouldn't require any energy. They really should be automatic. And so any amount of energy directed at a system that should be automatic is going to be exhausting. And it looks exhausting because on the outside, it doesn't look like they're doing anything. They're sitting there and they're sitting there poorly. They're slumped on their desk and it doesn't even look like they're trying. But internally, what's happening is that they're fighting against all of these reflexes that are happening. They're really trying to get their eyes to work when their eyes are not working properly. They're often struggling to filter out irrelevant information, which is very exhausting. And so internally, there's just tons and tons of work going on. And even when kids put in a lot of work, like these things should still be automatic. It shouldn't take that much effort. And so it can just be exhausting for things that shouldn't be so difficult. Learning
Homework,
by itself, I was gonna say, like learning in
right.
general is already hard. Like when you're learning a new thing, you're learning a new skill, that takes a lot of effort. And, when you're also fighting your body at the same time, it makes it hard.
Yeah. Homework battles are legendary in families with a retained ATNR. What do those meltdowns actually look like, and what really is going on underneath the tears and the I can't do it?
Yeah, I mean, usually that's kind of just a kid that's really reached their limit. They're exhausted, they're working really hard, they're frustrated. We're trying to power through and get them to do something that they really can't do. And I think like it would be helpful for parents, because a lot of us, if it's been a long time since we've tried a new skill, can forget how difficult it is to learn something new. Like you see that I see that a lot. Like I train jujitsu, and we get a lot of adults that come in to do jujitsu and they're new. And when you first start, it's like drinking from a fire hose. I mean, it's just so much information. You're so bad at it at first. Like everybody, there's this huge learning curve. But so many adults don't do things like that where you're trying new skills, and it can be easy to forget how hard it is to do something that you've never done before or learn something that you've never learned before, and that you have no context for. And so it's a lot of work to learn new skills and learn new things. And so for kids too, when you're trying to force them to learn something that you think they should be able to learn because of their age, but developmentally they don't have the tools for, it really makes that a lot worse. You really want to like learning should happen in this like very specific range where it's challenging enough to keep us interested, but not so hard that we can't do it. And that is a very like individualized place to be. And so when you have kids that are really like we're trying to force them to learn something that they're not ready for, they spend all day in a classroom doing that and learning new things. They're probably not moving enough. A lot of kids too aren't getting good school lunches and school food and enough nutrition to like really support their body. There's just so many things that are going into their tolerance and ability to do these things that of course they like reach their limit and melt down and are frustrated. And if you do something, if you're trying to read over and over and over again for and it's not working, of course it's going to get frustrating. Of course you're going to start to feel like you can't do it. It just makes sense.
Outside of school, the ATNR shows up in bike riding, swimming, ball sports, and judging distance. Why do those specific activities give kids with retained ATNR such a hard time?
Well, I mean, those ones to me seem a lot more obvious than the learning piece of things, and that this is a reflex that affects our body and the way our body moves and the way we coordinate our left and right sides. And if, our head moves and our arms and shoulders follow, it's going to be hard to ride a bike. It's going to be even hard to learn things like driving. My little brother is talking about this now. He has hopefully he won't mind me talking about this. I don't think so, but he still has an ATNR reflex and he is learning to be a skydiving instructor. And you have to be able to like move your head and not have your body, like if you adjust your body, it changes the direction that you spin when you're falling. And so he's been having a really hard time trying to coordinate that because his head moves and his body moves too. And so now we're going to be working on trying to separate those two things for him. But it's true for kids too when they're trying to do like all these sports and these kind of physical things is we want our head to be able to move without our body moving at the same time too. So when you have things like a retained ATNR reflex, that can be a lot trickier.
Is there a too late to fix the ATNR or is adults can
Nope.
be? Yeah.
Nope, adults, yeah, you can. There are some trickier things with working with adults, and I will do it for him because he's my brother and I love him, but I avoid most adults if I can.
What about robot-like walking, awkward running, or that clumsy kid label? Can that trace back to ATNR also?
Yeah, ATNR and a lot of different reflexes. I see anytime I see kids that are really clumsy and uncoordinated or like really stiff and robotic, they just don't have good fluid movement. That's kind of a red flag to me that there's something going on. Could be reflexes, could be some other things too. But the way our body coordinates and moves is really reflective of how our nervous system and brain has learned to develop. And so anytime you see older kids that are struggling with their body, it's always just like, maybe there's something going on internally. Maybe there's some reflexes, some brain things that are not quite right. But yes, all of the main thing that we are doing during those early stages of infancy, like the main form of learning, is learning how to control and coordinate our body. So most of our learning early is physical. And so when you have older kids that are struggling with different aspects of that, it tells me that maybe they didn't quite get everything that they needed neurologically during those early stages.
And could part of that be also like skipping the crawling stage and going
Yeah,
straight to walking?
yeah, all of those pieces are connected. I mean, crawling. There's so many things that crawling is helpful for other than just getting to walking. We kind of look at that and think, oh, it just doesn't matter because they don't need to crawl, they need to walk. We don't crawl today. But crawling itself is building a lot of different connections in the brain, a lot of different connections in the body. It's helping to develop a lot of visual skills and a lot of sensory skills. So there's a lot of important things about crawling. And really, all of those early stages have different important roles that they're playing in helping our brain and body to grow.
Hmm. Is there a simple way for parents to check for a retained ATNR at home, and what should they be looking for?
Yeah, so there's one test that I can talk about because it's already like it's been published and there's a book actually. Let me back up and say this one. There is a book called Reflexes, Learning and Behavior by Sally Goddard Blythe, and she actually puts in quite a few of the tests that we use during the assessment. There's a there's just like one or two for each. And when we're doing like a full assessment, we're looking at a lot more things and it's a lot more in depth than just these. But these are kind of a really good screening tool that you can use to check for some of these things at home. So actually, rather than me trying to teach you how to do it over a podcast, I would say go get her book, Reflexes, Learning and Behavior, and you can use that as a screening tool, understanding that this is like a small part of what a really like comprehensive diagnostic assessment would look like, but it can be a really great place to start to be like, do we need more support? Do we need to look into these things further? And she's got several, not just ATNR, but a lot of different reflex screening things that you can look at in that. And she explains it in really good detail, gives you a lot of information about why that's important. So that's a great place to start.
So many kids with retained reflexes get sent through years of tutoring, occupational therapy, vision therapy, or even medication before anyone checks their reflexes, if they get checked at all. Why is the ATNR so commonly missed?
It's not just the ATNR. A lot of these primitive reflexes are missed. These are not things that we tend to be checking for outside of the early infancy stage. So it is a part of like normal well child checks during infancy to make sure that babies are neurologically intact. And then we just assume that they go away and other things develop properly, and we don't tend to check later on, which is a real shame. I wish that it was just a normal part of all of our early well child checks that we're seeing, like, are they on track with all of these different things? But it's just not something, especially in the US, that we know a ton about. It's growing. It's something people are becoming more aware of. But certainly when you talk about your mainstream medical providers, your pediatricians that are, following up with kids, it's just not a part of their education. It's not something that they're looking for. Um, so it gets missed. I wish that reflex testing was a part of all diagnostic screening. So if kids go in for a diagnosis, I wish that, psychologists were trained to evaluate these types of things too. I think we'd get a more holistic picture of what's going on.
When a family figures out that ATNR is part of the picture, what does the integration process look like, and how quickly do parents typically start seeing changes in reading, writing, and confidence in their children?
Yeah, so it depends on where we're starting. The academic changes tend to come towards the end of the program. Generally, not always. So when we're looking at kids and reflex development, we always work developmentally. So we always work in whatever order these reflexes should have integrated and developed in early infancy. So if, for example, we have a child that has a really strong Moro, that's an infant startle reflex, we might spend a long time working on that one before we get to the ATNR reflex. Now, a lot of times, though, we still see read improvements in reading and writing and academics when we just work on the stress response because all of a sudden they just have more tolerance and they are able to focus their attention better and they're less easily overwhelmed. They're able to like work harder at school, that type of thing. So sometimes you start to see these things come into play early. Other times for other kids, we have to really get this cleaned up and then we work on the ATNR reflex and then things start to come together. On average, I work with kids for about 2 years. And typically and that's going to be kids that are like have a lot of things. They have the social, emotional, and academic things. If I have kids that come in that don't have a Moro reflex, that just really have the academic stuff, we tend to see progress a lot quicker, and that program tends to be a lot shorter. But if they're coming with a lot of the emotional stuff too, then we work on that first. And then, typically we're seeing changes in reading and writing within that first year. Um, if we're working on if we're talking about just like emotional problems and progress in general, I usually start to see progress within a month or two of working with kids. So it really varies depending on what's going on with them.
So, if Anything that we've been talking about sounds familiar to a parent in themselves or in their child. Who would they reach out to first about getting an assessment?
So there's only a handful of us in the US that do it. You can go to inpp.com or it's not .com. I can't remember. You go to I'll send you the link actually, so you can put it in the show notes. But go to the Institute of Neurophysiological Psychology. They have a list of people in the U.S. that do this, so you can see if you can find some locally. There's also a few of us, like me, who will work with families virtually. And so if you are concerned about your child, you can always go to my website, fill out a screening questionnaire. We can set up a phone call. If I know of somebody that's local to you and you want to go in person instead of doing virtual, then I can get you hooked up with somebody local. There's not a ton of us in the US that do this. So you may have to find somebody like me who does virtual stuff too. That might be your only option, unfortunately. But to be honest, I love working with families virtually and I don't find that there's a lot of downside to doing these things virtually. So that's where I would start.
If a parent walks away with just one thing from this episode, what do you most want them to know?
Hmm. The main thing that I want families to know is that like we should be setting our expectations for kids based on where they're at developmentally and being careful, kind of considering this optimum spectrum of learning where you want it to be hard enough where it's challenging and interesting and not so hard that it becomes overwhelming and that you're just like f pushing something that isn't going to happen. Really, one of the things that I hate seeing the most is kids that have struggled with school so long that they just hate it. They hate reading. They never think they'll read. They think reading is the worst thing in the world and they've been pushed so hard for so long that they just really have an aversion to reading because reading is one of the best, coolest, most important things that we can do, and I want kids to love it. And so I just don't want people to be afraid of adapting things to meet kids where they're at. That can be so helpful in lots of areas of learning.
Yeah. How can parents get a hold of you?
Probably the best way is my website. It's earlyrootsTherapy.com. I've got tons of information on there, a blog, podcast, lots of resources for learning. And then also, if families are concerned about their child, they can go fill out a screening questionnaire on there and schedule a free phone consult. So I offer free phone consults to see if this type of program would be a good fit for your child. It'd be better to look somewhere else first. Um, and then if not, and then also I'm on Instagram and Facebook. So both are at Early Roots.
Fantastic. And we'll have that in the show notes as well. Emily, thank you so much for your thoughtful insights. My biggest takeaway from every one of our conversations is that kids have been labeled as lazy, distracted, careless, or not just strong academically, or so often doing extraordinary work with nervous systems that's fighting them every step of the way. And once you understand what's actually going on, the whole picture changes for the child, for the parent, for the teacher, and there's so much hope here. For everyone listening, we have a full breakdown of the ATNR in a blog post, including infographics that show exactly what to watch for at home at fledglingsfight.com. Emily has tons of resources on her own website. You have no excuse for not being more informed about these reflexes. That is your homework, parents who are listening to this, to go over and educate yourself because it can make a really meaningful impact in you or your child's life. Again, Emily, thank you so much. I really always love having you as a guest.
Thank you. I love being here.
Thanks for tuning into A Parent's Guide to Child Development, where we decode milestones, demystify meltdowns, and occasionally question whether goldfish crackers count as a food group. Spoiler, they do. Make sure to follow us on Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an expert tip, breakthrough strategy, or aha moment that can make a big difference in your child's development. It's cheaper than therapy and less messy than glitter slime. We'll be back soon with more expert advice, real talk, and zero judgment. Until then, keep calm and try not to step on any Legos.